those boomers who elevated freak into a compliment and turned party into a verb.
I was more worried about the mindless stunt he pulled in Norton's office, because it meant Lenny's manic cycle could be kicking in.
The one on Mother's chest. Noun, the Tottenham scar. Raised stripe where a breast had been.
This picture was a strikeout kid on the league. People were supposed to hold hands off of him. Literally, I was not necessarily going to hit it. I came about 13 years ago. I was hired by Creighton University for a teaching position, and I came out and very quickly fell in love with the place. So it feels very much like the part of the country I'm from southern Indiana and some of the farm country in Pennsylvania. And you know, it's not quite as hilly as I'm used to in Pennsylvania, but it's the landscape is similar, so I felt at home. Well, I come from a family that pretty much, I think I'm the first person in my family who went to college. I went to a small Quaker college near where I grew up, and then for an MA in English at the University of Michigan, and PhD in English at Penn State, and then an MFA in fiction writing from the Iowa Writers Workshop, and then I had a fellowship for a couple of years at Stanford University in their creative writing program. So I'm kicked out of lots of schools. A lot of influence in the last couple of years especially. When I first started writing, I told myself I needed to write about places I knew well, and that meant mostly Pennsylvania, where I spent most of my growing up. But in the last couple of years, I've been writing stories set in Nebraska, in Omaha, and out in the country now where I live. So I'm sort of getting interested in the landscape. I was always interested in the landscape, but I didn't know if I could do it justice. And so it's a good influence, yeah. Well, I guess my mother is a very passionate reader. She's a fanatic about Civil War books, novels, histories, everything, and that was always a great model for me. In college, I had a writing teacher, literature teacher named Phil Rizzo, who was an unpublished novelist, but a very good novelist and a very, very smart man, and kind of an acerbic man. And he was the kind of teacher who kind of challenges you constantly. And I learned a lot from him, and became a good friend with him. And he kind of pushed me. And then at Penn State, I had a number of teachers there. A lot of poetry teachers. University of Michigan, the poet Donald Hall was a very strong influence on me. For the earlier part of my writing career, I wrote mostly poetry, and Hall was a very good influence that way. And then later on at Stanford, the fiction writer and poet John Lheureux, the former Jesuit, was a very good mentor to me, who I seem to find all of these writers who are a little pushy, a little bit cantankerous, and John and Phil and Donald Hall too were sort of all the same kind of caliber of funny, challenging, smart writers who wouldn't settle for anything but your best. Well, I had always written fiction, but I did it on the side in a way, and I thought poetry was what I loved and was good at. And when I applied to the Writers' Workshop at Iowa, I applied in both poetry and fiction, thinking I didn't know, I'd cover my bases in a way. And they accepted me in fiction, but not in poetry. So I thought, well, maybe I'm better at fiction than I thought, or worse at poetry than I thought. And I still write poetry, but it's sort of more private for me now, and the fiction is a more public form. But I think the fiction is informed by poetry in the sense that I care about the language a lot, and try and sort of work the language in musical ways and things like that. So I think of them as very close. From about 14 or 15, I started writing, and I think it was for very personal reasons, trying to sort of get some control over my world. And it became a habit that I couldn't break and finally didn't want to break. So I'm a little bit like a person who exercises, who runs marathons or something. I get very itchy if I can't write, if for some reason I'm busy with something else, and I have to get my sort of daily dose of writing in, otherwise I'm just miserable to live with. All kinds of things, from meeting interesting people to reading good books, to reading a good poem, seeing a good movie sometimes, a piece of music, all kinds of things kind of trigger an impulse to go write it down. Some while ago, in Iowa City, I came upon a mother and her 5-year-old son, and he was crying, and she kept saying, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And finally he said, "You're hurting my shadow." And he pointed to the ground. It was very snowy, and there she was standing in his shadow. His shadow had fallen under her feet. And I was so moved by that, and so suddenly brought into the little world of that little boy, that in the way he saw things, that I sort of had to run home and write it down very quickly and find a place for us to put it in the story. So those aren't very literary kinds of influences, but to me they're one of the reasons for writing, is to kind of get down on paper some of those interesting things that happen in life. I think I do. I'm not sure I choose them on purpose, but I grew up in a very working class family, in a very economically depressed area, and I'm sort of more interested in the poor and in the working class than I am in, I love the New Yorker and I love reading the stories, but often those characters seem to me to be in exotic vacation places, and I have trouble identifying with it. I'm identifying more with characters who have to get up and go to work and things like that. So there's that, and I'm also interested in fathers and sons as a kind of theme, in the whole kind of tortured world of men, mostly self-torture. I have to work in a lot of different times and places, but the kind of condition that I like best is getting up first thing in the morning, as early as possible, sometimes as early as 5, and no later than 7, and to work for 3 or 4 hours solid without any distraction. We live out in a farm in the country, and I have a little shack that I can go to where there is no internet and no telephone, and I would be very strongly tempted by those things if they were handy, but they're not, so I have to write. But then I've worked in the evening too, and all kinds of times. But somehow in the morning it seems like I have the freshest kind of approach to the work. I think I try for a fairly direct kind of writing that's not too artful, doesn't show off too much. I very much admire the Canadian fiction writer Alice Munro, and she once said, "You want in all cases for the story to get through your writing." And it occurred to me that, words could be kind of like a bramble bush or something if you weren't careful. And so I sort of want the words in a way to disappear so that the story can come through. I admire writers like John Updike, who's such a wonderful stylist, but I often think, well, it's a little too distracting, that style sometimes, and the story has trouble getting through. So I did a lot of work in the theater when I was younger, and I admired lighting designers who could light a stage and not let it seem to be lit. It was so natural, it just looked like the world. It just looked like the way the life would look. And I thought, if I could write prose that was like that disappeared so that the story came through, I'd be a happy man. I guess I write for a reader who is open to possibilities, who's maybe not expecting too much as far as a certain kind of ending, a certain kind of happy vision of the world. I'm sort of more interested in irony and things like that, and I know I've had readers sometimes who will come up and say, well, I didn't like that character, or I didn't like what happened to him, and I want to say, well, I didn't either, but that's the way they came out. Well, I teach creative writing, so I have that conversation very often. I'll tell you, maybe surprisingly, the thing I tell them most is that you just have to be willing to sit in one place for a long time. I am not one who thinks you have to be gifted or that there's just some special magic. I mean, I think it's true that there's some gift and there's some magic, but I think mostly it's a matter of persistence, of just sitting down and writing and rewriting a lot. And maybe that's the real advice, is you have to be willing to rewrite, because great writing doesn't come out of the first draft. It comes out of the 6th or the 10th or the 50th draft. And I think a lot of my students don't quite believe that or want to believe that. They want to think you can just do it, bang, there it comes out of nowhere and it's wonderful, and they move on to the next story. But it's, I tell them there's some pain involved in this process. Oh boy, I've got all kinds of projects. Gee, I've got 3 books in various states of completion, and I'm very eager to finish all of them. A memoir and well, actually more. Gee, I've got a novel in the works, a new collection of stories, a creative writing textbook. So I've got too many things happening at once as far as projects go, and I'd like to finish at least a couple of them in the next year or the next 6 months or so. And I'm very close to finishing a couple of them anyway. Well, I'll tell you, one of the kinds of writing I've been doing recently with my wife. We were hired to write screenplays for Roger Corman, the movie producer, and so I've been reading books about screenwriting and about making movies, including Sidney Lumet's book called Making Movies. He's a wonderful director of films like The Verdict and 12 Angry Men, and he's very, very smart about how movies get made, so I can't help devouring that and a number of other books. John Irving's book, My Movie Business, a memoir of the making of Cider House Rules. I just finished reading that. I'm reading a collection of short stories, the latest Best American Short Stories volume, which is just wonderful, edited by Walter Mosley, the detective writer. And I'm not at the moment, but my wife reads a lot of mysteries, and she passes them on to me. So I'm often right now they're stacking up next to my bed. So I'll be back to one of those pretty soon. I'd like to read Dennis Lehane's book Mystic River, which I have waiting there, because she liked it a good bit, and we liked the movie. So I sort of want to see what the book is like. Well, probably the last book that I was really excited by was Louise Erdrich's novel, Last Report on the Miracles at Little No Horse. I think I've got that title right. Just a wonderful novel, and I had always enjoyed her work, but this time I read this book and I thought, you know, she really is one of the 5 or 10 best writers of fiction we have in the country. She's got this wonderful, very complex world, complex but not difficult to understand, and it's filled with magic and all kinds of passion and mystery, and she's just a wonderful writer. And that book I thought was just a very exciting kind of dip into her world. I'd read earlier books of hers and enjoyed them quite a bit, but this one struck me as, you know, even better, I thought. So I'm very excited about that one right now. Nebraska, one reason I came to Nebraska, I mean, was a job offer, but the other was that I was so interested in the people of Nebraska and the landscape. And it just occurred to me that you know, it was so easy to step outside your door and meet interesting people who were not overly citified, who were, you know, still in touch with the land and with history and with a way of life that you know, they themselves may not be farmers, but there's still a sort of rich sense of the land, and I hope I'm getting some more of that into my writing than I used to have. I think I was more of a city boy before.
Good evening. My name is Joanna Lloyd, and I am curator of the Heritage Room. Welcome to the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors and to the John H. Ames Reading Series. The Heritage Room is a special collection dedicated to preserving and promoting works by or about Nebraska authors. Currently, we maintain a collection of over 12,000 volumes written by more than 3,000 published authors from Nebraska. In one way of promoting these authors, the Heritage Room sponsors the John H. Ames Reading Series. This is our 148th Ames reading. We are proud of our traditions. I would like to thank the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association because it is through an endowment established through their volunteer efforts that we are able to bring you programs like this. You should feel that you can come in to visit our collection during regular public service hours, too, for individual tours or to enjoy the Heritage Room as a reading room where anyone who is interested can come in and read from our collection. Our reader tonight is Brent Spencer, faculty member in creative writing at Creighton and a splendid writer at the same time. Spencer is the keeper of a website on Nebraska authors, and I understand that he is doing work toward this summer's Nebraska Summer Writers Conference. He was a Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford and won a James Michener Award at the Iowa Writers Workshop. His novel, The Lost Son, I haven't yet read, but his book of stories, Are We Not Men, I have. After having an initial trepidation about reading about men as, quote, victims and perpetrators of a patriarchy in flux, unquote, the publisher quotes Margaret Swick here, I began to read, finding comedy, insight, significance that felt totally wonderful. I'm sure that you will enjoy tonight's reading. Let me introduce you to Brent Spencer right away.
Thanks, Joanna. Thanks, Joanna. Ah, Marley said that, Marley Swick. When the publisher said that, we're going to call this book Are We Not Men, okay. I thought at first that I wasn't sure that was a good idea because it might alienate half the potential readers. But they said, no, it's a joke title, it's sort of fun, and so we'll take our chances. But I have had to defend the title or explain it 100 times to people who thought maybe it was a little incorrect in terms of gender politics or something, so I apologize. I want to read a news story tonight that's, first thank everyone for coming on a school night of all nights, but I want to read a news story from a new collection I'm putting together, and it occurred to me as I was looking it over that maybe there are two things that aren't as clear as they should be in the story. So I'll warn you about them, and so when you hit them it'll be clearer, and you won't think that there's a mistake in the story, though I think there are at least two stories. One is just a reference to medjool dates, the fruit, and very tasty. The character runs them down in this story, but they're actually a very tasty form of fruit. The other is a reference to, a veiled reference without a full explanation, to the Mexican movie industry. One of the fascinating things I learned about the Mexican movie industry was that back during the heyday of Tarzan movies and things like that, apparently at night Mexican filmmakers would use the same sets that were used during the day for the Johnny Weissmuller Tarzan movies or the Dracula movies, things like that, only they'd do the same story in Spanish with Mexican actors. And I just found that fascinating, that there would be this kind of round-the-clock movie making on these sets. So there's a kind of indirect reference to that world in here, and I realized reading it today that it doesn't really explain. Somewhere the explanation fell off the page, I guess. Anyway, this is a story called Down in the Jungle Room. Leonard Wesley was sure it all looked very symmetrical from the air, but from the ground, the Desert Breeze Resort and Racket Club seemed laid out like a lopsided wagon wheel. Every time he left his room, he got lost. Was it a right turn, a left? He was constantly stopping other guests and asking, begging them to point the way. A young man in tennis whites called him old-timer. A mother made him hold her daughter's hand as if he were another of her children while she led him back to his room. It was embarrassing. It was unforgivable. This wasn't early onset Alzheimer's, was it? Of course, at 64, could his case really be called early, if that's what it was, Alzheimer's? But how could it be? And what rude joke of God's to give him Alzheimer's when his wife was a health policy expert on that very disease? It was monstrous. They'd come to Palm Springs for the American Biomedical Ethics Conference. "It'll be fun," his wife had said. "While I attend boring panel discussions, you can lounge by the pool and watch the girls in their bikinis." It was insulting, he thought, that she would treat him like an aged peeper on the lookout for jiggling breasts and buttocks through the dark lenses of his sunglasses. Couldn't he sit here by the pool and read his newspaper? Insulting, too, that she wasn't more worried about his running off with one of these girls. It was possible. He wasn't so old, and maturity was prized among young women, or so he'd read in one of his wife's magazines. Yet it was especially insulting when not one of those young women had responded correctly when he'd looked over the tops of his sunglasses at her to pay a compliment on her tan, her tone, her hair so wild and right. Was he no more than an ancient curiosity who deserved that frozen stare, that frightened whisper? Maybe it wasn't Alzheimer's. Maybe it was life. He'd been at loose ends ever since he'd sold his medical linens business, something he'd stumbled into. After a succession of odd jobs that stretched into his late 20s, he'd been hired as a hospital orderly. Mostly he made beds. Hospitals went through a lot of linen, he noticed. And soon he had the idea for the business, which eventually grew to the point where he was featured in Hospital Linens Today. And that led to there is such a magazine. And that led to the buyout offer from a large hospital services corporation. Wasn't that the way of things? You get so good at something that they pay you not to do it anymore? It was for the best, he figured. The money was nice, and anyway, the business had become too much like rocket science. In the beginning, it was about clean sheets stretched taut as drumheads. Now it was filled with tiring talk about linen utilization management systems and pounds of linen per adjusted patient days. Better to get out while he still had some life in him. But life for what? That was the question. "Beautiful day for it," he said, lowering his newspaper. Her hair was the same color as the time-darkened oak of their kitchen cupboards, and her cheeks reflected the shimmering light of the pool. She'd taken the chair next to his and was slathering sunblock on her neck, on the slope of her chest. "Excuse me," she said. He gestured at the glowing clouds, the blue sky between them, the universe spinning on its little pointed stick. "It's a great day for tanning," he said. Her two-piece was a little smaller than her tan, giving her a white outline at the edges, like a misprinted picture in a newspaper. She studied the sky with a sour expression. "Not really," she said. "I like more sun." She burped another dollop of lotion onto her palm and began with the long brown leg closer to him. It was a wonderful leg, already tanned to perfection, except for the white ring at the top of her thigh. The woman stiffened, then gathered up her things and left. Had he been staring? Maybe he was an aged peeper after all. Just then, a boy with a buzz cut, about 10 years old, hauled himself out of the pool and stood panting at the foot of Leonard's lounge chair, his big flowered swim trunks dripping all over everything. He gazed back at the pool for a long moment and then turned again to Leonard. "You know that stuff they put in pools to change the color of the water when you pee?" he said. "Well, they don't use it here." A walk was what Leonard needed. He wore his golf cap until he was off the motel property and then crushed it into the bushes. His hair was thinning badly on top, but so what if his scalp got burned? He wasn't old, and he wasn't losing his mind. He walked down Palm Canyon Drive, staring into shop windows, half intent on buying Sarah a present. He looked into jewelry stores, realizing suddenly that he had no idea about his wife's taste in jewelry. What kind of earrings did she wear? Those discreet button-like ones, or did she prefer the gaudy dangles? After 34 years of marriage, you'd think he'd know. Try as he might, he could not remember a single gift he'd ever given her. Not one. He looked up from the black velvet tray into the young clerk's eager eyes and said, "I'm sorry, I have no idea what I'm looking at. What I mean is," but he interrupted himself. What was the point of explaining? They were wrong about which sense was the first to go as you aged. It was your sense of taste. "No problem," she said, returning the tray to the display case. But it did seem to be a problem. He could tell by the way the near ends of her eyebrows were trying to tie themselves together. He was an old man on whom she had wasted her time, her youth, her high, taut breasts. He tapped the edge of the display case with the side of his index finger. "I'll be back." "Sure," she said with cheerful disbelief. Out on the street he closed his eyes and took a deep breath of desert-baked air. Her nose ornament had confused him. The tiny silver spike piercing one nostril made it hard for him to think. She looked as though she had wandered into the business end of a fly rod. He wanted to go back inside and tell her so, but that would be rude. He headed down the street, letting her think he was doddering through early dementia. He looked at pottery stores, at designer clothing stores, but he couldn't tell if his wife would like any of it. He not only did not know her taste, he seemed to have no taste himself. He browsed a shop that sold, quote, indigenous desert soaps. What did that even mean? And could you really give a woman a gift of soap without her taking it as a comment on her personal hygiene? And anyway, the sharply sweet scent of the place made his head hurt. At a folk art store, he examined African masks and Malaysian puppets, but they were all too frightening. He went into several shoe stores, but he found the shoes, too, with their big square heels and their wildly canted soles, somehow oddly frightening. Besides, he had no idea of his wife's shoe size. He was beginning to think he had no idea of his wife at all. A long walk down a desert street had turned her into a faint memory, a hazy abstraction, an insoluble mystery. It was getting on toward late afternoon and time to go back to the hotel. A stiff wind had kicked up, littering the street with large brown palm leaves from the gigantic trees that lined the street. Twisted, brown, glistening, the leaves reminded him of things he had seen in the war. He tried not to look at them. Why was it the things you tried to forget stayed with you, while the things you wanted to remember, like your wife's shoe size, drifted straight out the open window of your mind? The walk back to the hotel seemed much longer than the walk downtown. Several times he stopped and gazed back at the way he'd come. Maybe he was headed in the wrong direction. But there up ahead was the jewelry store. At least he wasn't lost. He was tired. Or maybe he really was old. Or maybe the desert sun was getting to him, the hot wind blowing off the sand, the shimmering blue mountains. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had a drink of water. He began to panic. He thought he could feel all the moisture being sucked out of his body. It wasn't the long walk back to the hotel. It was something biological. He needed water. He needed medical attention. The jewelry store rose before him like salvation, and he staggered into its coolness. The same clerk greeted him a notch or two less enthusiastically, he thought. "You're back," she said, "just like you said." She was terribly thin, he noticed now, in her simple black dress and white pearl necklace. Her short, dark hair was cut in jagged blades as if to accent her thinness. And that thing in her nose, the spiked fence of her face. "Water," Leonard croaked. He gestured toward the cooler he remembered from his business. "May I?" When her gaze followed his pointing hand, he took it as permission. He filled his paper cup many times, drinking long and deep, his back to the clerk. He didn't care what she thought of him. He'd remembered the cooler, hadn't he? He wasn't some medical specimen, not yet. With every desperate swallow, new life filled his veins and flooded his tissues. When he was finished, he turned back to her, suddenly aware of the pressure in his bladder. "The bathroom is for customers," she said, automatically, and then, "Oh, back there." She gestured toward an alcove he hadn't noticed before. When he was finished, he came back to the display case, intent on buying something to show that he wasn't taking advantage. His gaze fell upon two old buttons from a manual typewriter, the D and O. He thought there must be some mistake, that some flea market items must have fallen into the case. "They're earrings," the clerk said. "Back in the day, they were parts of a typewriter. Remember them? Cool, huh?" "I'll have those," he said. They cost $40, which struck him as a lot for old typewriter buttons, but it was too late to change his mind now without looking foolish. She slipped the earrings and a receipt into a slender black paper bag and gave him a faintly automatic smile. Too late. She already thought he was a fool. "Where have you been?" Sarah asked when he found his way back to their suite. He'd had a problem finding his hat. He kept reaching into the wrong bush, each time like reaching into the jaws of an animal. And then he'd wander the halls of the hotel looking for the suite. When he was about to give up, about to go whimpering to the first available person, the room appeared before him as if by magic. And there was his wife, examining her makeup in the mirror she'd propped in the top slot of a stand for travel brochures. Sarah returning to him from abstraction into vivid, extravagant reality. Sarah in her turquoise caftan with brown highlights cinched with the Navajo concha belt they'd bought at Taos last year, and the matching concha earrings. Suddenly the typewriter earrings seemed foolish, a child's gift, and he reminded himself to return them the next time he was out. "A walk," he said, heading to the bed. "I've been looking around." He stretched out, hoping to hide the last traces of his panic. "That's good, sweets. I worry about you being bored. I didn't know this conference would take so much time. The trouble is, you run into a colleague, and you just have to go to their boring presentation, and then there's a reception, and then another colleague who begs you to come to his boring panel. It's the eternal grip and grin." Despite her words, he thought he detected a note of pleasure in her voice. It was the world she knew best, the world she was comfortable in. "I have to have dinner tonight with colleagues," she said. "Do you mind making do on your own?" "Nothing to it," he said. He was thinking about the plague of embarrassing deaths that cursed the men in his family. His grandfather's Model T hit a bump, popping his head through the canvas roof, the only injury, the fatal blow to his pride. I have to say that my male ancestors have all died by these deaths, so nothing made up here. Popping his head through the canvas roof, the only injury, the fatal blow to his pride. An uncle missed the edge of his bed and sat down hard on the floor, the shame alone enough to kill him. His father liked to read the funnies while he walked to lunch. One day he was so engrossed he stepped in front of a bus. Witnesses reported seeing tears of laughter in his eyes. And now this, an Alzheimer's sufferer married to an Alzheimer's specialist. Idiots all. As Sarah left for her dinner, he waved weakly, his hand a faltering bird. He was asleep before it fell to the bedspread. When he woke up, Sarah was still gone and the bedroom lights were out. The clock radio showed the time as 6:30, but he couldn't tell if it was AM or PM. The sun filtering through the gauzy curtains could have been either. But surely Sarah would still be here if it was AM, unless she had an early breakfast. Climbing out of bed was like climbing out of a well. He felt exhausted, weak, sore, and hungry. Maybe it was the desert playing tricks with his mind. He made his way to the hotel restaurant, casting nervous glances over his shoulder, trying to keep his route in mind, hoping to find his way straight back to his room this time. If he'd had breadcrumbs, he would have strewn them. At the crowded restaurant, where it was clearly dinner time, he ordered a Manhattan and a steak, then sat back to study the customers, most of whom were wearing the red-edged name badges of the conference. They were an odd assortment of doctors, scientists, and policymakers, and they seemed to be having a wonderful time eating, laughing, and calling out to each other across the noisy dining room. It was odd. Alzheimer's researchers shouldn't be having this much fun. A harried busboy in a stained apron came to clear an old water glass and a crumpled dollar bill from the other side of the table. "How's this conference treating you?" Leonard asked. The busy boy looked at him wearily and enumerated the enormities. "No tipping, no screwing." And then he saw her 3 tables away, Sarah, sitting with colleagues, lifting a forkful of paella into her tight conference smile. He stared at her, willing her to turn to him, but when she did, she seemed to look through his grin and wave, then turn back to her colleagues. Sarah was not a woman who liked public attention, public forms of affection. Most of the people she worked with didn't even know she was married. He'd never held it against her, even now, as she refused to acknowledge him. In the working world, married women weren't taken as seriously as single women. She'd told him that. He'd seen it for himself. Still, he couldn't help feeling hurt, and when he looked up again to find her table empty, a little bereft. In the early days of their marriage, she hadn't cared so much about how things looked. It used to be they'd go to parties where she'd get just a little drunk and say delicious, naughty things. Things that were remembered and quoted for days afterward. At a party once, she described the hostess as welcoming her guests with open hams. And another time, when some deeply earnest social worker had said, "Sex isn't supposed to hurt," she'd quickly replied, "It is if you do it right." He loved the sudden laughter that filled the room, the stunned look on the social worker's face. He loved the way Sarah pressed 2 fingers to her mouth after saying it, trying to stem the flow of irreverence. She was beautiful, brilliant, delightful. She was sexy. She was his. At that moment, he loved her more than ever. And for years, all their moments were that moment. But then the world seemed to turn a corner, and everyone became more like the earnest social worker. No one got the joke anymore. The same offhand comment that provoked peals of laughter now seemed unprofessional and vaguely indecent. So she became professional. She became careful, not just about how she appeared in public, but about everything. He still loved her, but it was like the love you have for an old song. You never hear it quite the way you heard it that first time, that time it gave you chills. They'd talked about it, Sarah explaining away the change with, "I guess we just grew up." But it was more than that. Something was lost. The next morning, he left for his walk, taking the earrings and the hotel's complimentary pen with him. On his way down the confusing corridors, he stopped at every turning and wrote a brief instruction at eye level in the margins between the scrollwork patterns of the wallpaper. He would not get lost again. Once outside, he left his hat on. He had nothing to prove or disprove. Let the clerk think what she wanted. "What's wrong with them?" the clerk said. "What?" The clerk, wearing the same black dress, and made a mouth at him and shifted her weight onto her other hip, as if she were settling in for a long explanation of the obvious. "You said," she said slowly, "that the earrings are wrong." She examined the post. "You mean they're broken?" No. I mean wrong for the wearer, for my wife. She doesn't like them?" "She wouldn't, no." I realize that now. Buyer's remorse. Looking at him doubtfully, then turning the earrings over on her palm, she said, "I guess I can let you exchange them as long as you swear they haven't been worn." "I swear, because that would be a health code violation or something." Right, I swear." This time the clerk didn't pull out the black velvet trays of earrings. She only gestured to them through the top of the glass case. He looked at them for a long moment. I just don't know," he said. "How about the teapots?" she said, leaning down to pull out a pair of tiny silver dangling teapots. "Teapots," he said, they're cute, but a younger woman accessorizes to show off her looks," she said. "An older woman, her personality." "Is that so? That's very interesting." It sounded like something she'd read in a bathroom magazine. Behind him, the door opened and another young woman came in. "Sorry," the woman said as she stepped behind the counter, hanging her bag on a wooden peg and running her fingers through her black hair. "Won too many clubs last night. Go home. I'm on the job at last." "Thanks," his clerk said, unimpressed by her remorse. She turned back to Leonard, explaining, "I'm not even supposed to be in today." She held the teapot earrings a little higher. "You want them? Something else?" He studied them, but they seemed even more wrong than the typewriter earrings. "Well," she said, laying them down on the counter, "if you do, Pat can help you. I'm out of here." She turned away and began to collect her things, a shoulder bag and a gauzy blue scarf. Before he could say a word, she swept past him and out the door. "Pat," the clerk said, standing in front of him, "here to assist you with all your jewelry needs." He couldn't help himself. He followed his clerk outside. What was he doing? Was he trying to pick up this young woman, this girl? What was he trying to prove? When he caught up with her on the sidewalk, he said, "Do you want to go somewhere with me?" He had no idea what he meant, what anything meant. She'd wrapped the long blue scarf around her neck a few times, but now she arranged it more carefully, studying him. "Like where?" I don't know, somewhere. There must be lots to do in this town, interesting sights to see." "You mean like celebrities?" I suppose, because 9 years I've lived here and I've never seen a celebrity." "Well, then, gardens, houses." "This is the desert. The only things we grow here are cactuses, golf courses, and celebrities, supposedly." "Cacti." "What?" The plural of cactus? I think it's cacti." And then he said, "I'm sorry, it's a nasty habit. Grammar." "That's okay," she said, "but don't let it happen again." "I'm just looking for some company," he said. "My wife's at this conference, and I don't even know you, but even so, you're the only person I know in town." She looked at him, letting her eyes play over his face until it made him uncomfortable. "How old are you?" He recovered himself well enough to say, "Too old to be thinking what you're thinking?" But was it true, or was he only fooling himself? He remembered the young woman who'd run away from him at the pool. "You're funny," she said. She headed down the street and didn't protest when he followed her. Without looking back over her shoulder, she said, I don't have a car, and since you're here just visiting, you probably don't either. That kind of cuts down on the sightseeing possibilities. There, he said, pointing across the street. What's that? Before she could answer, he led her by the arm to a small park. She hung back a little as he led her, like a kid in hopeless protest. This is crap, she said, as they stood before the patches of indigenous cacti, a narrow path unfurling among them. This place has nothing but cacti, she said, cocking her head and adding, to be totally grammatical about it. But these are indigenous to the region, he said, reading the embossed sign next to him. The young cared so little about the world. There was a large red plastic button on the sign. He pushed it. After a whirring sound, the bush next to the sign began to speak in the voice of Frank Sinatra. Welcome to the ornamental cactus garden, a gift to the city of Palm Springs. Frank was tired and bored. Planted here are representatives of all the cactus to be found in this region of the Southwest. We hope you enjoy these exquisite examples of nature's handiwork. There was another whirring click, and then the bush fell silent. Nature's handiwork, she repeated scornfully, but she took a few steps down the path, stopping beside the tall wand of a century plant in full raging bloom. It looks like something off of Star Trek, she said. Agave Americana, he read aloud from its plaque, feeling suddenly ancient for resorting to Latin, as if he were trying to contradict her. And in truth, with its 10-foot stalk rising from a base of spiny leaves and its clusters of yellow tentacle-like flowers, it did look extraterrestrial. Star Trek, he said, forcing a chuckle. What do you do, she said, turning to him suddenly. Nothing, he said. Between jobs, as they say, she said. No. She held up her small hand, and he expected her black bracelet to slide down her arm. Then he realized it was a tattoo. She said, Hey, I've been there, man. No need to explain. I was just curious is all. Money is the Route 66 of all evil, as they say. And if you knew what all I've done for money, your hair would fall out. She seemed to see his hair for the first time. Well, more of it, I mean, she said. Looking around the park one last time, she turned to go. I'm tired of the spiny kingdom, she said. She retraced her steps to the sidewalk and began to walk down the street. He followed. There was something he had to explain to her, something she had to understand, but he had no idea what it was. Her face had the round simplicity of a child's, and yet she disguised her features with black gashes of eyeliner and lipstick so red it made her mouth look like an open wound. He wanted to ask her why she made herself look so severe, but he knew it would only make him seem older. Her name was Alice, a name he didn't think parents gave to girls anymore. She'd come to Palm Springs one summer for fun, and then, after graduation, she'd come back to stay. It was an expensive town, she said, but not if you knew your way around. I eat at a lot of church fish fries, VFW barbecues, and I'll drop everything for a pancake feed. She stopped walking and turned to him. Tilting her head and studying his face, she said, Buy me something. Buy you something. Yeah, anything. Doesn't matter what. It was a child's request of a parent, he knew that, and yet he wanted to buy her something, something to show that his intentions were honorable, something to show himself that they were honorable. Just then a short bus came lumbering and wheezing to the curb, gray-haired women staring at him from each window. Some kind of neighborhood morality squad, he thought, fully expecting to be dragged away in chains. The door squealed open, and a tired older woman with a tight cap of white curls stepped down from the driver's seat. When she reached the sidewalk, she leaned her thick torso backwards, hands on hips, sighing with relief. Taking no notice of Leonard and Alice, she headed into a storefront office. The sign stenciled on the window read, Famous Faces Tours. How about a tour, he said. The older women were stepping down from the bus now, their movements tentative, as if they were stepping onto the lunar surface. In a voice loud enough for them to hear, Alice said, You mean like get on the bus with a lot of geriatric cases? He was embarrassed, for the women, for himself, a little angry. Come on, he said, it'll be a hoot, maybe. It sounds like a total bore, if you want to know. Her words stung. Even his instincts for fun marked him as old. But what did she expect? I suppose your idea of fun is buying drugs in some back alley, he said. Now that would definitely be a hoot, she said. Hoot, hoot. Okay, let's do her. Which? Was she asking him to buy drugs? She took a few steps toward the office door. Come on if you're coming, she said. It's your idea. Inside, he was dismayed to find that she was right. The small office was crowded with elderly tourists, strung with cameras and plastic shopping bags from the Tony shops along Palm Drive. Leonard stood at the end of the line of people signing up for the next tour. He lost track of Alice, who was standing in another line, this one for those who wanted a sample taste of medjool dates, the prize reserved for those who finished the tour. A woman in a cook's apron came down Alice's line with a platter balanced on one hand. On a doily were about 50 small cubes of date, each one skewered with a toothpick. When Alice took hers, she held it up to the woman in the line behind her and said, "Looks like a dead fly." She popped it into her mouth and made a face. "Tastes like one, too." A frantic look came into the woman's face, and she stepped out of line. Alice joined Leonard, opening her mouth to show the cube of fruit on the tip of her tongue. She was right. When it was their turn at the counter, he was surprised at how expensive the tour was. The basic was $12, but the deluxe was $24. "Which should we get?" he asked her. "Up to you," she said, but it was clearly a test. He could tell by the way she gazed off at the ceiling. "Well, I can't very well deny Alice the deluxe tour with its full complement of famous faces." He gave the clerk a 50. When he took his seat beside her on the bus, he felt as though he were a father on an outing with his daughter. The other tourists, another collection of senior women, paid no attention as they filled up the bus. He looked around to make sure, yes, he was the only man on the bus. The driver climbed on, aiming her red, sun-stunned face at them. "Geez," Alice said, "please, God, don't let her stroke out on us." Oops, sorry. "Welcome to Famous Faces Tours," the driver said mechanically. "The finest tourist attraction in all of Palm Springs. Yes, you'll see the homes of the celebrities from stage and screen. You'll see stars, stars, and more stars as we take you into the backyards and boudoirs of the rich and famous." Abruptly, she took her seat behind the wheel, saying over her shoulder, "Please stay behind the white line when the tour commences." Alice turned to him and in a lisping stage whisper said, "Oh, I can't wait for the tour to commence. This is going to be a hoot." As she spoke, he could see that she still had the small wad of fruit on the end of her tongue. The driver rammed the bus into gear, and the tour jolted to a start with the driver's dry recitation of wonders. "Here we have the lovely home of Rock Hudson, the charming home of Kirk Douglas, the modest home of Bing Crosby. And here at the top of the cul-de-sac is the Elvis and Priscilla honeymoon home with its round living room overlooking Ladera Circle, once known as the House of Tomorrow. Quite interesting in its own right." I've been on that tour. This is exactly what they said. The bus bumbled up and down the narrow streets, winding up the hills and coming close to freefall on the way back down. Leonard couldn't tell one house from the other. They might have been one long house, a succession of stuccoed arches, shaded by palm trees and high hedges. "And there, high on the mountainside, is the futuristic Bob Hope Party House." Alice leaned close and said, "It looks like a bad mushroom." The white head across the aisle turned to us. "This is important," she hissed. "Well, I'd rather see the futuristic Bob Hope, not his house." She leaned close to Leonard and whispered, "They say half of his body was operated animatronically toward the end. Here at the corner of Bilardo and Vistacino, Carol Lombard and Clark Gable spent their honeymoon. And here is where Cary Grant and the poor little rich girl, Barbara Hutton, lived. When shopkeepers saw them, they'd say, 'Here comes Cash and Carry.' And here's the home of Goldie Hawn, the home of Barry Manilow, the home of George Hamilton." "Excuse me," Alice said, raising her hand like a kid in school. "I asked the passengers to please be quiet," the driver said. "Excuse me," Alice said again, "but do the celebrities live here like now?" The driver bounced a quick searing glance at her off the rear view. "Well, if you're asking whether we'll find Mr. Cary Grant at home, I'm asking if we knock on Mr. George Hamilton's door, will Mr. George Hamilton answer? Or is he long gone? Did he sell the house years ago, which is what I think?" The driver pressed hard on the accelerator. "If you look sharp, you may see Miss Lily Tomlin. In fact, Miss Tomlin often brings visiting friends on this very tour. I have shaken her hand. I have petted her 150-pound herding dog. I have waved to Mousie Powell, widow of William Powell. I had my gallbladder out in the Dolly Sinatra Surgery Tower." "William Powell," somebody said. "Sinatra," said someone else. "That's peachy," Alice said, "but where are the leggy starlets and studly stars of today?" The driver leaned into the turn as the bus swung sharply into another palm-lined street. "Here we are on Writer's Block, where you'll find the homes of Ray Bradbury, Joseph Wambaugh, and Sidney Sheldon." Alice began to shout. "Is it true what they say about Bob Hope? Toward the end, was his brain cabbage?" She stood up in her seat. She stood up in her seat, holding onto the back of the seat in front of her. Is it true that in the last years they put this thing in his ear, linking him to a room full of writers who told him what to say? How long was that true? She was in the aisle now, climbing forward toward the driver. There were hisses and ancient hands grabbing. And is it true it was a celebrity look-alike who died in Sonny Bono's skiing accident? And why? America wants to know. Grimly, the driver said, here, if you look sharp, you can see over the hedges into the backyard of the former home of America's sweetheart, Dinah Shore. Alice, clinging to the seat backs, began to chant, we want our leggy starlets. Give us leggy starlets. Most of the other passengers just stared. The woman in front of Leonard turned with tear-filled eyes. Do something, she said. The heavy woman across the aisle laughed into her open purse. The driver yanked the bus to the side of the road so hard one tire jumped the curb. She cranked open the door. Out! I have absolutely had enough abuse, a young lady. She was talking to Alice's reflection. In all my days driving this bus, I have... Yeah, Alice said. And to Leonard, come on, let's blow this pop stand. At the front of the bus, she bowed to the driver and pointed at Dinah Shore's backyard. Excellent hedges, she said. And then to the passengers, absolutely first-rate celebrity hedges. Out! The white-haired driver yelled. The crying woman yelled, go peddle your papers! The bus pulled away, the tire snapping viciously as it rolled off the curb, leaving Leonard and Alice standing in a cloud of sweet blue exhaust. After a moment of silence, Leonard said, that was different. Alice had begun to walk, one foot in the gutter and one on the curb, like a little kid. Leonard followed. He had no idea where he was or what he'd gotten himself into. The sudden heat hit him like a hand closing over his heart, but he was determined not to look old and foolish in front of this woman, this girl. Catching up with her, willing his breath to slow, he said, what things? She stopped. What? His heart raced. It had nothing to do with the heat or the sun bright in their faces or the assemblage of his time on earth. The things you've done for money. Like what? She stopped with one foot in the gutter, one on the curb. The black cotton dress with its string of pearls and long blue scarf made her seem like a little girl who just raided her mother's closet. She tilted her head to one side, studying Leonard with one eye. Then she started to walk again, talking almost to herself. Well, once a guy said to me, if I give you something, will you do something? It was really weird. I did it just to see what it would feel like. Not good. Actually, I threw the money away. Can you believe that? Leonard said nothing. It was the saddest thing he'd ever heard, sad and exciting all at once. No, she said. I mean, do you believe it? Because I made it up. Excuse me? Because isn't that what you wanted to hear? Some tawdry story about my tawdry life? How about that one, huh? Tawdry. That's got enough grammar to power the space station. They walked along in silence for a time, past the prehistoric-looking palm trees, past the anonymous beige stucco faces of houses shut tight against the afternoon heat and against the prying eyes of people like him. He could feel it again, the bone-deep dehydration, the hollow ache behind his eyes. He needed water, a lot of water. But there were no stores here, only the tidy houses and palm-strewn street canting crazily before his eyes. The spiked fence of Alice's face rose up before him. You look like sick, she said. It was then that he saw the open lockbox hanging on the doorknob of the house nearest him. He staggered to the door, barely able to stand. His eyes throbbed with every tired slap of his heart. A woman in a trim, dark business suit answered his desperate knock. Leonard swept past her into the cool, dark interior and to the kitchen. He held tightly to the edge of the sink with one hand and drank with the other, refilling his glass many times. When he was finished, he turned to apologize, but the woman stood next to the dining room table, watching him curiously. It had happened at last. He'd become the specimen he always feared. The house seemed to have stopped time in 1970. A wrought iron room divider separated the living room and dining area. The furniture in both was made of heavy dark wood that would not have seemed out of place in a medieval castle. The kitchen counter and appliances were avocado. The floor was covered with avocado shag carpeting, a worn and faded path from stove to sink. Hot, Leonard said. That's Palm Springs for you, the woman, a real estate agent, said. Are you and your daughter Savage fans? Alice, who'd been inspecting the living room, said, oh, we're Savage fans, all right. We're Savage for just about everything. Seeing Leonard's confusion, the woman said, Alejandro Contreras? better known as Buddy Savage, the Mexican Tarzan? No? Well, until he died last month, this used to be his house. Now it's on the market. She nodded over her shoulder toward the living room, the rooms beyond. It's a good house. Small, but good. Isn't that just America? Alice said bitterly as she wound the frail blue scarf more tightly around her neck. One man's tragedy is another man's opportunity. I don't know about that, the woman said. Mr. Buddy lived a good long life and died in his sleep at 98, surrounded by family. Where's the tragedy in that? Alice looked around. What's tragic is the decor of this place. The woman nodded, smiling. Well, if you think this is something, follow me. She led them down to the basement, where the walls were gold and silver-foiled zebra stripes, the space filled with tropical plants, their broad, spiny leaves arching out in every direction. The rug was deep green. In the center of the room, half hidden behind tall, leafy plants, was a green metal desk. In the far corner was a small fountain playing into a basin of artificial stone. From hidden speakers came faint jungle sounds. "Welcome to the jungle room," she said, sweeping palm leaves aside and walking them toward the desk. There were photographs and framed contracts half hidden by the leaves, movie posters, black and white stills of jungle scenes. The largest of these showed a tall, muscular Latino in a loincloth standing next to a lion with half-closed eyes, its tongue a limp gray flag. "You remember now?" the woman said. From behind, he heard Alice's small, insistent voice. "I am so totally bored." Maybe it was the dense foliage, or the throbbing zebra walls, or the heat waiting outside to pounce on him. Maybe it was another stage of his disease. But just as the woman turned off the light and the room fell into total darkness, it became hard to breathe. He felt dizzy. His heart lurched in its bony cage, bringing him slowly to his knees. The ache in his shoulders, neck, and arms was strangely reassuring. So this was it. Not Alzheimer's at all. Pain lowered him to the floor, to his back, his eyes bright with it. Overhead, the ceiling churned with tiny phosphorescent stars. Monkeys screamed in the distance. Wild birds stuttered and screeched in the tangled treetops. And lions came creeping toward him through the jungle's silver ribs. "Wait," he whispered. "Yes, yes, now I remember." Thank you. Thank you.